In short, the presentation that Richard will be going over, I'll be placing a link for everybody to access it and download it locally themselves. If you have any questions, please type the questions in the Q&A box, and the individuals will address the questions as we can going through the webinar process.
Okay, you still having a hard time hearing me?
Yeah, it's because of your.
How about now? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you for interjecting, Omar. Anyway, if you would let us know what area you're participating from, would be a great help. We'd like to, I know we have some national guests, some a global participants as well. It would be a great help for us to know where you're coming from, say hello. And with that, I don't want to take any more time because this is about you and helping your families. I'd like to start off by introducing Richard Isaacs, our special education attorney, and Dr. Karen Wilson, our neuropsychologist. And Richard, if you want to take the floor. Richard, your mic is off.
I know how many jokes we made about that. That happens to me all the time. Thank you. I'll make this quick too, because what we really wanted to do was have a lot of questions and answers and have meaningful answers. Dr. Wilson is excellent. I'm hoping that I can answer some of the questions on the legal side, maybe without being too specific. We can't give legal advice, but we can give a lot of direction of where things are going and share ideas. So I hope this is meaningful. The downloadable form that we put together, it goes into detail about where we got to since March with the school closure, some of the new legislation, a little bit of the guidance from the feds, the U.S. Department of Ed, as well as the California Department of Education. At the end there, it'll go into SB 98, and I'll go through a quick presentation of slides here. But I do encourage everybody to read that, highlight some things, and there's some questions that you can develop from there to ask your IEP team. I think it's going to be very, very helpful for a lot of families. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so really quick, we're going to go over the timeline of the COVID-19 school closures, a little bit of the IDEA, and really and simply, nothing's changed out of the IDEA, even though school districts, unfortunately, are out of compliance in some of those areas. And then we'll talk about the Senate Bill SB 98, and what that has done is given guidance into the 2021 school year. So you can flip to the next slide. A quick timeline, on March 4th is when California declared its national or state of emergency due to COVID. I think there might've been like 5 cases at that time in California. It was still pretty early. By March 13th, that's the first executive order that came out. And then at March 17th, we got Senate Bill 117. And this is in the stuff that I sent out to you guys. Once we got to April, a lot of schools had closed down or they're going to reopen for spring break. So a lot of schools, if we remember back in March, once they closed, they did open in a different format, and that was the distance learning. The CDE issued on April 9th guidance for school closures, and that really tried to take, okay, so what was happening in the classroom, how do we transfer that into the home setting, which for some it worked out well, others it was disastrous. By June 29th, we got to Senate Bill 98 was passed, and that is supposed to address some of the failures of the spring with some ideas going forward. We'll talk a little bit more specific about that. July 17th, the schools were ordered to close in counties on the state's watch list. I think in California, that was the majority of the counties, meaning the schools had to close, both public and private. That was the districts were really scrambling at that time. By August 3rd, elementary school waiver process was given, which means even though the school was closed, elementary schools could apply for waivers. I don't know of any schools that applied for the waivers that we're working with. They were just focusing on trying to open up overall. But that's a really good process, and that might come into play later this year if schools close again. August 25th, That's the latest guidance was given on school opening in cohorts. So you didn't have to apply for a waiver, but you could open in small cohorts. You could bring special ed students back to campus. You could provide in-person services. At least, you know, a lot of the districts that we work in, they're going to start opening up next week. Some of them already brought back kids this week. And some of the other districts are opening in October. Some have set dates for November to open. So you can go to the next slide. The U.S. Department of Education and the California Department of Education on March 4th, this was their guidance. And it said during school site closures, so when the school is actually closed, physically closed, school districts must provide equitable access to students with IEPs, with services appropriately tailored to the individualized needs of the students to the greatest extent possible. It's really key here because all the guidance from the educators, the CDE and the U.S. Department of Ed was to the greatest extent possible. All the services in the IEP should have been implemented. And unfortunately, you know, and I don't want to knock, you know, the schools in the difficult situation they were in, but we know that that didn't happen. There weren't services for a lot of our students, even though that was the guidance that was given. Go to the next slide, please. So if we jump ahead to Senate Bill 98, which came out in June. So we had that early guidance saying implement the IEP to the best extent appropriate or possible. Now we go to June 29th. So IEPs must include a description of the means by which the IEP will be provided under emergency conditions. This is an adjustment to the law. This is required now in all IEPs going forward. They're going to have what it's going to look like in an emergency condition. Right now we have COVID, but down the road it might be something else. The new requirements apply to an initial IEP or the next regularly scheduled revision of an IEP to include distant learning and in-person instruction. Senate Bill 98, it changes the education code. And again, there's detail in the literature that you can download. It specifies what distance learning is, where the teacher and the student are separated, and it specifies what in-person instruction is. It also provides funding for this school year, a lot of money to school districts for proper cleaning, for services, and it also provides funding for special education, and it requires school districts to come up with a plan on how are they going to address the regression, but how are they going to address things going forward caused by what happened in the spring. If you read what was given, there's some really good questions that you should ask and develop from that information. Just really quick, going to it. One of the things that SB 98 requires is the mitigation of learning loss. In addressing learning loss or accelerating progress to close learning gaps, they have to come up with specific things for each student. This could be extending the instructional school year. It could be increase the amount of instructional time or services. It could be academic skills and intensive instruction. It's everything that you could think of that your student's gonna need to access their education. Those are the discussions that the IEP team should be having due to the COVID-19 learning loss. Go to the next slide, please. The biggest thing to remember is it's important that you work with and not against your child's IEP team during these difficult times. I've been at, you know, 3-4 IEP meetings. We're having short IEP meetings. For a lot of the families that we work with directly, we've requested IEP meetings. We really want to sit down with the team and figure out what we're going to do going forward. We can always clean up the past, but we really are trying to figure out what's it going to look like the next month? What's it going to look like 2 months down the road? So the IEP teams, we're trying to have really positive meetings. Sometimes, you know, the questions can't be answered. The district they don't know what they're doing yet, but they're trying to figure it out. So the idea is you're going to come with great solutions of what your child needs. And with that, that's where we're at. That's a little bit of the timeline. That's the new guidance going forward. I'd just like to open it up for questions and answers so we can really get to the heart of some of your questions.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should.
Okay, when we go back to school, since we're going from an IEP to distant learning, it's very different kind of an IEP. Are the parents, is it okay for a parent to request a 30-day emergency IEP and to have the IEP team tell the parents exactly how their transition learning for their children are going to look like and incorporate it into the IEP, because it's not the same as it used to be. It's a different style of learning.
Right. So yeah, I would encourage everybody to request an IEP meeting, and in California they have 30 days to hold it. And as a reminder, there's nothing that has changed these timelines going forward. So they have to have the IEP meeting, and we're taking the position, though some school districts are not, that if we want to discuss distant learning and we want to put it in the IEP, they need to put it in the IEP. A lot of districts are. So what we're doing is we're having the offer of FAPE, but then we're discussing how is that going to be implemented now? How is it going to be implemented when school returns? There's a lot of districts that are deciding to bring students back in cohorts or like a hybrid program. That's going to be difficult for some of our students. If they're going to try to keep them isolated, what about the students who get mainstreamed? Where's their class? What if they're in virtual learning and they want to continue because of health reasons in the virtual learning environment? How are they going to get their related services? That's exactly why you should request the IEP meeting and have those questions answered, and they need to be answered. And if they can't answer it yet, they need a table specifically what can't be answered and get back to you once they understand what their program is going to look like.
I have another question from Marie Scott. Are these laws for South Carolina as well?
So, I can't wait on the South Carolina laws, but if you look at the Individuals with Disability Education Act, there are certain requirements in that legislation. And that legislation is implemented through the Code of Federal Regulations. They do give states authorities on timelines to set different timelines. So a lot of this is coming from California, but the IDEA hasn't been waived at all. So the idea, you could look at your state when it comes to what's the timeline for requesting an IEP meeting. But you should absolutely request an IEP meeting, and whatever timeline they have, that should be in place. And all these questions about how they're going to implement the offer of FAPE, that needs to be answered. There's no waiver of that. So they need to specify, because as a parent, the only way you can meaningfully participate in the decision-making or the development of the IEP is if you clearly understand exactly what's being offered and how it's going to be implemented. So on one hand, if you have a list of goals and services, but it's unclear how it's going to be implemented, or they're just not implementing it, you can't meaningfully participate. So the way you ask your questions is really important. And just walk down every service and say, well, how are we going to implement that in distant learning? And how are we going to implement that once we go back to school?
Okay, another question, it's in the chat box, I'm not sure. It's this Deborah Fierro is asking for clarification for students with IEP. Parents should request a meeting to revise the IEP.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, if the IEP is being implemented well, you wouldn't have to. A lot of the families that we're in contact with, they're struggling because the IEP is not being implemented. Or the district's trying to change the IEP, but they can't. I mean, the IEP is the IEP. That's the offer of FAPE. That was what was agreed upon. So at some point in SB 98, that's going back to the California, every state's might have something simpler, is looking at, well, what do we do to close that gap that was caused? And what do we do to address the learning deficits going forward? The best thing, and it would encourage, is have an IEP and talk to the team. Ask your questions to the district directly. They're going to sit around the table and you're going to have your specialist there and your teacher there. How are we implementing this? It's a really big piece. So unless you're really happy of how everything's going and you feel that the related services, all the accommodations, all the modifications, if there are any, are being implemented, then you wouldn't need to request an IEP. But I think a lot of families have questions or concerns that the IEP is not being implemented in its entirety, and those questions should be asked in an IEP meeting.
I have another question now. Actually, I'm going to read it for you. I received this off of a post. It's a parent that says they live in California, which chose to blanket postpone all IEP meetings at the end of last year due to COVID. We are now starting to make them up. And I noticed that all the updated proposed goals on my son's draft IEP are noted to be met by September 2021. I assume this means they intend to now hold his IEP in September moving forward. Do I have any standing to request that we keep it for May 2021?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because there's a couple of pieces there. One, it's unfortunate. They should have had IEPs. A lot of districts were having IEPs. Back in April, I can understand, or early March when they were scrambling, understandable. But a lot of the districts that were handling things, they were doing the best they could by having IEPs. Also, that's not the case here. The IEP was canceled. When you look at having an annual date, sometimes I feel that we put too much into the actual annual date. The idea of having an annual IEP is really, you should have one IEP and you should set goals for a year, and then you come back and look at progress and adjust it and develop new goals. The concern that jumps out is that they've just they've adjusted the date to the goal. So parent would have to consent to that. So the goals should still be tracked within the year. Even without the education, that shows that if the goals weren't met, then we're going to have to talk about additional services. There's no escape from that. We know that they're going to have to provide additional services, but just blanketly carrying the goals over for another year is really problematic, and I wouldn't consent to that. And that should be adjusted. Again, this isn't legal advice. You're going to have to talk to the team. But and then to answer your question specifically, do you have to agree to change the annual date? In California, the districts are going to have to, the annual date set with the initial IEP. Sometimes we have triennial dates, which are different than the annual date. None of that makes sense to me. Just what date are you using? And if you don't want to change the date, just tell the district you're not changing the date, that you like your May annual date. You don't want to change it. And if they want to have any IEP in between, they can have an IEP amendment. So if you aren't comfortable changing the date, don't agree to change it.
Okay, I have a question. Can I ask the participants to ask the questions in the Q&A? So I'm not jumping from the chat box to the Q&A box, but I'm going to ask this question from the chat box, and then I'm going to go back to the Q&A box. This one's from Katie, and she's saying there's a minimum of hours for students to be connected. My son is a 5th grader in an autism class core curriculum. Can I ask reduction of hours? He is getting overwhelmed with so many hours in front of the computer.
Yes, absolutely can reduce that or ask for a reduction. And again, this is just, you're in the driver's seat as a parent here. And I've talked to a lot of families who are in tears. Their child's crying, they're stressed out, they're crying because they're just overwhelmed by now. We never want to set the students up for a failure. And in all honesty, the school doesn't either. They're trying to work within the framework that they have. They're putting this information on, they're setting the schedule. It's hard for them to realize that it's not working for every student. So the best way to do this would be to communicate with the school and say, hey, they're not going to participate. Or if they start getting overwhelmed, I'm pulling the plug. If they can go on for 30 minutes, great. If they can't go on at all, that's fine. We're going to have to find a new solution. But don't ever feel the pressure that you have to work within the framework that the school has set up, because that's a general framework for everybody. And the idea of having an IEP, that individualized program, is it needs to be individualized for your child. So what works for you or what doesn't work is going to be different for somebody else. And that's what the IEP team can fix. So just like we can change the school day when the kids are going to class in person, we can change the virtual learning as well. So specifically, you can write what you're going to participate in and what you're not going to participate in. Request an IEP team meeting to discuss that and make sure everybody understands and is on board with it. I hope that helps. And, Dr. Wilson's going to add in some information here too, because she's going to look at the, how do we get that information and what the students need? How are we looking at the lost learning and what do we need to put in place? There's a lot of these students are going to need assessments. And Dr. Wilson, feel free to jump into.
I would love to jump in, because one of the things I'm thinking of and I'm hearing a lot about from people who are calling our office is that a lot of the intervention are not translating well in a distance learning format. And the other thing a lot of parents are reporting is that there's a social and emotional response to the distance learning that is having an adverse effect on a child's ability to access the curriculum in a way that didn't happen when they were in school. And I think it's really important for parents to convey that information to the school. I've had parents say my child would run out of the room when the Zoom call comes on, or they will turn the video off, and they're not able to access the curriculum in that way. And in those cases, I think it's so important to communicate to teachers and to the school about how your child is responding to this change and this shift in the mode of instruction, because that means that something needs to be changed in terms of the kinds of supports that are being put in place, that are supposed to be put in place to help kids access the curriculum. And for some, the mode of distance learning is actually creating a barrier to being able to connect with the learning in general. And for some kids, there's actually an added layer now of anxiety and stress associated with this, with this COVID landscape right now. So a child, for example, who was struggling solely with reading or with attention or with focus and did not have any anxiety previously may now have anxiety and stress that is having an adverse impact on pre-existing learning issues. And in that case, again, there needs to be a change in the level of support that children need in order to be successful.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Another question from Sarita. None of the staff have ever met my son. He is not a good Zoom candidate. So how will he be able to assess his needs to set goals?
Go ahead, Dr. Wilson.
I think there's a couple things. There are kids who already have an IEP, and so I think there's two kind of families that I'm kind of addressing. It's the family who already has an IEP, and you're trying to assess progress, which I think this might be the question. Assess progress and whether or not a child is meeting their goals. And then you have parents who are observing difficulties for the first time and are now wanting to request an IEP to determine whether or not what they're observing is a learning disability or some other health impairment that's impacting learning. And so I think there's typically what would happen pre-COVID is that there would be an assessment process as part of the IEP. And maybe Richard, you can speak to this, because what I'm hearing from a lot of parents is that there are no evaluations being conducted in person, and that some school districts are not permitting those evaluations to be conducted via video conferencing or telehealth. Is that correct?
Yeah, unfortunately, but our position is the district should be assessing. We have a lot of assessment plans coming out now. Our position was we were getting assessments for some students back in May as well. And I say that because a lot of districts weren't doing that. But where we're at, we can't look backwards, but going forward, the assessments are key. They need to be doing assessments. There was, I think it was SB 117 that came out in March. This is California, the Senate Bill 117. And it said during the school closures, the timelines are like it's summer vacation, which means all the timelines in the education code are paused. And once school resumes, the timeline continues. So for getting an assessment plan in California, the district has 15 days if they know they need to assess to provide an assessment plan. Well, that was stopped. That was told during the school closure. Our position was, though, once virtual learning started, school's back in session. And we were requesting assessments because nothing in SB 117 changed the federal law. So the assessments still needed to take place. They have 60 days once they start, absent, school breaks over 5 school days, and which would include summer. We're out of summer, schools are back in session. They need to provide assessment plans and they need to assess. Now we are still getting some districts saying, oh, we can't do it in person or we can't. Those are just excuses. And I really encourage everybody to work well with the school district, but if you get a no, you got to find a way around that. And districts should be agreeing to assess, because as Dr. Wilson said, we need those assessments. And going back to the question, they don't know my child. They're not, they're not going to assess in person. How are they going to come up with this? They need to assess, and they can assess in person. And some of the school districts have set, I think on their Facebook pages, they put up pictures of, okay, this is the room that we're assessing in, so families feel comfortable. And there's the plastic barrier, and the assessor will have a mask. Depending on the type of assessment, if you need to see the student, speaking, if you need to read that, you can social distance. The publishers have put out information from the different assessments on how we can complete the assessments and still have them being valid. Dr. Wilson could talk about that properly. But to answer specifically, they really do need to assess. Now, if it's an academic assessment and they can do it virtually and you're comfortable with it, okay. But we have to come up with solutions to get the assessments going. So you must just request an assessment plan now.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think one of the things that families are approaching us about are the school observation aspect of the assessment. And my belief is that, I could sit in a Zoom classroom and still do some observations. Obviously, it's not going to be the same as being in person, but I think it still can take place. Is that your understanding as well, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. And you always have to observe, what if this was a homebound student? What if there was no COVID and we had a student who was homebound, because that's what the IEP required? We would still do observations. We just go in the classroom. What if a student's at a really restricted environment at a non-public school or a residential treatment center out of state? We still send somebody out to go observe. Wherever that student's accessing their education is where the observation needs to take place. Now, what could happen when school resumes is we need to amend the report. We need to have a second observation in the changed learning environment, and that's fine, but it shouldn't stop us from assessing.
Okay. I have another question from another parent. The districts are still having trouble with online learning. There is a lack of structure in place. Students are walking in and out of the lessons, and the teacher can't really help monitor the online students. What options are there for students where there is structure monitoring and the standards are taught both online and in person that bridge the gap? Emphasis on bridge the gap.
So I'll just rephrase that. So my understanding is, like, what do we do when the learning structure is not working out because students are in and out, or it's too busy for them, or is that the structure of the online learning they feel is not appropriate?
Yeah, that's what there is a lack of structure in place. Students are walking in and out of the lessons, and the teacher can't really help and monitor the online students, which is true. What options are there for students where there is structure, monitoring, and the standards are taught to both online and in person that can bridge the gap?
So I feel that school districts have gotten, or they're getting a lot better going into the 2021 school year. A lot of schools are going to open up in the next month, and it'll be really interesting to see. But we have to go back to pre-COVID. What would you do if that was happening in a classroom? What would you do if, and it depends if it's elementary, which is different than, say, your single subject classrooms in middle and high school. But what would you do? You could call an IEP meeting. You can make a change. You wouldn't want your child in a classroom if they were so distracted because kids running in and out and there was no teacher control. Well, it's the same thing here. If they're not able to access their education, you need to articulate that, put it in writing, and ask the district for alternative options for placement. They could either be placed with a different teacher. They could be, if the virtual piece isn't learning, then they're going to have to look at a different format to provide their education. Something that Dr. Wilson is excellent in bringing the neuropsychs in and the psychologists, because they're actually going to come up with good solutions. As a family, and even as a lawyer, we don't know the solutions. What we try to do is articulate the problem. And as a lawyer, we'll look at and use the law, but we need to know, what does the student need? And I think Dr. Wilson goes back to you of looking at, observing that situation and coming up with solutions, right?
Absolutely. And I think that, one of the things parents can do is to really document everything that they're observing. Document the difficulties, document where the struggles are, what things are making the difficulties worse. Again, the emotional response, because I think that mental health issues are often overlooked, and I think that they are now being exacerbated in the midst of this COVID pandemic, where there's distance learning and a lot of atypical ways in which education is being delivered to students. And so I think it starts with documenting what it is that you're seeing, and then really requesting, again, coming back to the assessment process, because you want to be able to assess progress. You also want to be able to assess regression, you know. And again, there's a difference in the way that information is being delivered. And for some kids, when they were in the classroom and they may have had a behavioral aid, or they may have had resource support in a small group, and the structure of in-person learning was helpful for them. The actual structure of being in one classroom, then being able to transition to another room, then being able to transition to recess, that structure actually helped learning. And for what some parents are seeing now is that structure has been removed, where now recess is at home, and it doesn't provide the same level of transition, the same level of structure, and that lack of structure can actually be a detriment to the learning process. And so making sure that you're keeping track of all of the difficulties and the areas of difficulty, even if they're new areas of difficulty, I think it's very important to document those and to come up with a plan, again, with the school in terms of how you're going to address that. For example, you've got kids who are using multiple applications to learn. So you've got kids who are using Seesaw and Gigi and Google Classroom, and they're using Epic and multiple apps. And for some kids, it's very difficult to navigate the number of applications that they have to use in a given day. Instead of using paper and pencil, they may have to use a digital platform to write. If you've got a kid with fine motor issues, that can be problematic as well. Even having to cut and paste and select and utilize those fine motor skills to move things around on a digital platform as opposed to paper and pencil, that can be problematic. And so if you're seeing those difficulties, then you want to convey that information to the school, because there may be another way, or you can request a different way for that work to be done, where you get an equitable learning experience, but it's not being done digitally. And I think it's important for parents to ask for that. If you're seeing a child struggle with demonstrating what it is that they know in a digital format.
I absolutely agree. And just adding to that too, you know, documenting, you can take videos too. I mean, the access is, I've had a lot of the families that we work with send us video, something that we can share. There's still, any privacy concern. The learning's in your environment. You want to be careful. You don't have to video the screen if there's video, but just seeing the behaviors of the learning or the distraction that's going on, there's just no way that they're going to follow anything that's on a Zoom classroom. If they're doing that, it's really helpful. And it's been really helpful sharing that with the IEP team, because oftentimes the administrator doesn't know the child, or they know the child very little. And in this format, there's not a lot of people that really see the child much. So they don't know what's going on in the learning environment. So bringing this information out, and without assessments, it's okay to ask the district, like, this isn't working. You can see it's not working. We've documented. What else do you propose? And Dr. Wilson gave some really good ideas there. There are alternatives, and they must be discussed.
Right. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of students benefit from, particularly kids with learning challenges, benefit from hands-on demonstration. They benefit from having the teacher sit beside them and show them what it is that they're expected to do, and have the child then kind of mimic what it is that they're supposed to do, or demonstrate that they understand. And that is very challenging to do across a video conference platform. And so it's hard to kind of see what the child is doing. The teacher can't see what they're writing or what they're struggling with. And then the child has to hold up their paper to the Zoom screen. And then you've got 21 other kids in the classroom who are trying to do the same thing. And so it makes it very difficult. And so again, it all comes back to documenting the struggle so that you can then address how to address it. Because the school won't know what needs to be addressed until you bring it to their attention.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wilson. And Richard, to piggyback on that, Documentation is so significant with right now distant learning more than ever. And if you're not sure how to document, you can videotape it, take it to the IEP, show them the videotape of your child physically having difficulties, distant learning. You can also have a log and put a date of the log and a little bit of one paragraph of what the struggles were and what was being learned and who was the teacher. And if the goals aren't being met, and you're having concerns about the goals not being met, you should put everything in like a diary, a log. You put the date and a brief paragraph of what's happening, because you can bring that with you to the IEP with your child, and now you have, for lack of better words, evidence of what's been going on at home, so that you can address your concerns and have the school help you out. I just wanted to piggyback on that.
No, just let me just add to that too, because when you are documenting, you really want to get a snapshot. So you should really look at when are they logging on, what's their behavior like, just every day. And I know it gets a little tedious, but remember that the teacher's not there. There's no service providers in the home right now. Not only is it helpful for the IEP team, but really it's going to be helpful for the assessments. And like Dr. Wilson, to go back and look and just read through like, oh, hey, so this is what was happening. Are the behaviors progressively getting worse? Is the actual time of learning going down, to see that, what was working and what wasn't. But you can take really good notes of your child's daily schedule. And there's a huge benefit, not only sharing it with the team or the assessors, but then on the legal end, it's really helpful for us if unfortunately we have to pursue something because the district's just not coming to the table. It's really good evidence of what was happening during this time.
Piggyback on your evidence, a lawyer taught me many, many years ago, if it's not in writing, it never happened. So the best advice I can give all the parents is document, because that's going to be a big help for you when you start asking for services and you have to show them why you're asking for these services. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say one more thing. You do it. It's easy to get frustrated. It's easy to get upset because you're the one dealing with it every day. And I would encourage all the families to have patience, document, make the request, give the school, there's going to be time for the discussion of how do we make up for that lost time. But as I really encourage them, as frustrated as you are, be as kind as you can when you approach this. Don't be weak in that. Push for what your child needs, but give the district a little bit time to figure this out, and we will get there.
Okay, I'm gonna go on to another question from Leanne. We can have an option to go on campus at school even if we chose the 100% distant learning versus the hybrid. My 10th grade son has Tourette syndrome and an IEP and is doing well in everything except math. He is struggling with math specifically online, and his tics and needs some sort on one-on-one help. What would you suggest?
Dr. Wilson, do you want to, or you want me?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would probably want to know is the math difficulty something new, or is this something that was present before? And was there a plan in place to address the math difficulties before? And if there was a plan and now it's no longer working because of the distance learning format, again, we're going to, go to the school and discuss the challenges associated with this, of implementing the plan for addressing math difficulty within a distance learning format. If this is a new difficulty, then again, you're going to want to go to the school and say that my son was not having struggles with math before, and now that we're in this distance learning format, he can't access the curriculum, the math curriculum, in this way. And then it may be requesting an assessment to determine why that might be.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. And I think something, and we keep going back to this or hitting on this, the learning environments change, but the FAPE requirement hasn't. So just like if your son was struggling, like Dr. Wilson said, in school, you would do the exact same thing in this environment. You would document it and you would bring it to the district to try to find solutions. And just some solutions that come to mind, if it's the specific teacher, request a different teacher. If it's a specific because it's online and he needs in person, then say, you know, and if you're comfortable, can you come to school just for math?
Mhm.
Or, you know, there's a lot of different types of math programs out there. Can you just come in and work in, you know, a resource room just for the math? Can he, there's private schools. We have students that go to some private schools just for math, just because the teaching seems to be a little bit better virtually. So they'll you know, or does he need one-on-one math instruction? Saying that you would do if he was in school, you'd ask those same things and you bring those same solutions, bring those solutions here. But it needs to be, you know, the school year is going to start, and struggling in math is really difficult. It's something that should really be brought up to the team, and ask them what, you know, what solutions are they going to offer, so your son's not struggling all year.
Absolutely. I think one of the difficulties that COVID poses is that when parents are seeing their kids struggle, it's going to be very difficult to determine whether this is related to a pre-existing learning challenge, whether this is a new learning challenge that is now being uncovered because of the situation that they're in. Parents may be observing things for the first time, or whether it is kind of a borderline challenge that is now being exacerbated because of either the stress and anxiety associated with the current situation, or the way in which learning is now taking place, where the kids can't utilize other strengths to compensate for an area of what might have been just a borderline weakness previously. And so I think the only way to really determine the reason for the difficulties that you're observing now is to, again, go back to an evaluation to make that determination. The evaluation, which includes an observation.
Thank you. Another question. Is there any learning center that offers one-on-one teaching that is structured, monitoring standards and skills, and available both in person and online? Parents don't want their children to regress even further. They want intensive intervention. So where do they go?
Do you have an idea with that one, Dr. Wilson?
I'm not sure about in terms of funding by school districts, but there are a number of places that offer one-on-one instruction, a lot of private companies, private tutoring companies, educational therapy companies that offer one-on-one instruction. And again, like Richard was saying, even in specific subjects. So I've had students who again, can't access the math curriculum and go to these places just for one-on-one math, or one-on-one for reading comprehension, or for a subject like science. And so those places do exist. And I think, again, you're probably going to have to talk to the IEP team about whether or not that would be an option for your child to access those services. But I know that they do exist.
Yeah, just adding to that too. If you want to privately fund, like you said, absolutely, and you can do Google searches. There's a lot of places that are providing, just some in California that come to mind, like Fusion Academy. They do one-on-one instruction. They're a private school. They have all the standards. A lot of our students who struggle in a big learning environment for a host of reasons do well with that one-on-one. And you can talk to the IEP team if you want to privately fund and seek reimbursement. There's certain ways to do that, in certain language you should bring to the IEP team and document, you know, that request. If you just want to fund it on your own, that's great as well. You can also ask for tutoring with the school district, and because students are going to have again, if the virtual learning is the environment, if that's where they're going to implement the IEP, because something to remember, the IEP is not a brick and mortar place. It's not the school. The IEP is a document that needs to get implemented wherever the student is at. So if it's a virtual learning, that IEP needs to be in place. And if they're not accessing their learning, or now, like Dr. Wilson said, maybe it's a new thing because it's virtual learning, or maybe they were struggling, you know, in a certain subjects anyways, they need to provide the resources to your child so they can access their education. So if you think tutoring would work, the school district can absolutely contract with private agencies as well, and they can send people into your home for tutoring. We have in-person services at home. A lot of school districts don't want to do it. There's the union thing. There's their employees. They may not feel safe. Parents may not feel safe to have somebody in the home as well. But if you are, there are non-public agencies sending people to the home for tutoring. or you can get direct access online. In these private schools that we mentioned, you can also go to their facility because they're going to be opening up too. So there is a lot of options. And Raja, we can be more specific too. I mean, we can respond to some of these questions and give, you know, sites, or at least start the search for parents when we respond to these questions in whatever you put up, so they can read the questions and answers later.
Okay, we can definitely provide resources. We have 4 more questions and we're getting close to 5. So I want to get through these questions so these families can have them answered. The next one is non-virtual distance learning an option for students with an IEP?
Non-virtual being like?
I'm assuming either in person or I don't know.
Maybe like well, if it's distance learning but non-virtual, so you just don't want to be on the video virtual, you just have distance learning.
That's what it seems like. Non-virtual
absolutely.
distance learning.
It doesn't have to be video. If you can't access it, the district, to the best extent or maximum extent, whatever language the guidance has, they have to implement the IEP, and in a way that your child accesses it. And this kind of goes back to an earlier question of, if you're struggling to access the format or the medium that they're providing it, that's fine. Don't access it that way. Document it and request to change it. The district can definitely provide everything in written format. They can provide videos if live is hard. They can provide audio if that's necessary. They can provide it all just almost like in a homeschool type program where you get the curriculum, and you know, if it needs to be accommodated, it should come accommodated, and then the student can work through it that way. Whatever you need for your child to access their learning, you need to request that from the school district and show why. As Dr. Wilson was saying, you need to be able to show why, and were they struggling before? Is it the new format? And that's the information that the district needs to really be able to make an informed decision, but help you and help your child learn, help adjust the program accordingly.
Yeah, I've had some parents ask the school for parent training because, again, the kids can't access the information virtually via video conference, and they've been trained to deliver the instruction, and they've been packets have been mailed home, or workbooks have been mailed home, and the parents have been trained to help their kids. And so that's something, again, to consider if parents are able to do that, to step into that role.
That's a really good point. And that's always been available. Parent training has always been available. It's just not something that we've used much. But now, because the classroom is the home, yeah, you can get parent training in ABA if you need that, because you're now serving as the ABA aide. You can get parent training in how to, deliver the curriculum. That's a really good point. I forgot about that.
Thank you. The next question. My district is allowing the students to attend school in person, in daycare, in a classroom, and then the students participate in online learning in the daycare center. There are aides in the classroom, but they are not able to help all the students in the daycare. The parents are paying for this daycare service. Should the parents have to pay for this daycare service?
That's a complicated question. I guess I have to know more about the daycare at school. Are they teachers that have to be back at school, and those are their kids who are kind of like in the daycare, and then they're accessing their virtual learning, and they have to pay to do that? Sorry, Dr. Wilson, do you?
I don't have an answer to that either. I'm not sure.
I'll do my best for who wrote it. Education has to be free. If you have to pay for the location to access it, typically the answer would be, well, no. But if it's a different location than the school, and the school that your child goes to is only virtual, but you are bringing them to a place to access it, that would be different. But I don't completely understand the question, I guess.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one. My son's annual IEP is due next month. He did an assessment testing before he started virtual academy this month, as month has mastered his goals. How can he be transitioned to some general education courses? What is the process?
Dr. Wilson?
Does that have to, I'm not sure if that's illegal in terms of, do you have to change the IEP to have a child moved from one mode of instruction to another?
I think they need to have an IEP. I've attended so many IEPs, and I've had this before where children are in special ed, and the parents feel that they should have more general ed courses or general ed time. You would have to hold an IEP, and again, document, show the IEP team why you feel this is important, why you want to make the change.
Yeah, I guess I missed a piece of the question. I didn't understand the question completely. What is the, Roger, can you just break it down?
He did, yeah. The young man has his annual IEP due next month, and they did an assessment testing before this whole virtual distant learning started, or virtual academy this month. I'm assuming this is homeschooling if it's virtual academy. And he has mastered the goals. How can he be transitioned to some general ed courses? What's the process if he's mastered the goals?
Okay.
And, yeah.
So let me just rephrase the question I understand. So he's mastered his goals, that we feel that he's ready for general ed curriculum. So what's that process? It's a really good question for the IEP team. You don't have to change your placement to access the gen ed curriculum. You can absolutely access the gen ed curriculum in like an SDC type, or through the SAI services. If you're looking at actually changing the placement to gen ed, like Dr. Wilson said, yeah, that's something that you would talk with the IEP team, but need consent. You'd have to actually, the district would offer it and you would consent. But if you feel that because they made such good progress that they should be in gen ed, even some of the classes, I'm not sure if this is elementary or single subject, absolutely. I know we keep harping on the document, but documentation is everything. You have to have whatever you request, you have to show why you're requesting it and have that data supporting that you want that change. But yeah, it would just be a great discussion for the IEP team if they met their goals already, and can they go to gen ed classes? But they don't have to change the placement. Just reiterating, you can access the gen ed curriculum in multiple settings, including a special ed class.
Okay, last question. This is from Jill. If a district is in a hybrid model, 2 days in school, 3 days virtual, 2 groups, A and B, self-contained, has a 4-day in school model. This Asperger's child's IEP states that placement is in the general ed classroom with core replacement direct pullouts to special ed classrooms for 2.5 hours daily. Does the child have a standing for accommodations for 4 days in school, but in general ed with direct pullouts, special ed like IEP is written, not only self-contained? That's a loaded question. You want me to break it down part by part? You got it?
I actually have it because
okay.
I think this is where we're going to see a lot of problems when school open. So I really feel bad for schools that are working really hard to open it up. Elementary schools could apply for waivers and open up fully. Schools, this is California, who are off the watch list can open up. However, they're opening up in this guidance of cohorts. They're really trying to keep the kids separate. It's problematic for our mainstreaming time. So if you're going to take the gen ed kids and put them on campus twice a week, and then the special ed kids are going to be on campus full time, what they're not doing is they're not mixing the two. So we have special ed kids who are not going to get mainstream because it's just not there. Their mainstreaming could be virtual. If they're even offering that. And then we have the reverse, that the kids are there 5 days a week, but they're not going to allow them to mainstream into the gen ed that's there two days a week. So that has to be fixed. They have to implement the IEP in its entirety to the best extent possible, which means they have the kids, they have the classes, they have to implement it. It's just going to be working with the IEP team to find solutions. So one would be, okay, so if your child's only going 2 days a week, can they go in a little bit? And they may not, because they want to keep those groups small. So how are they going to access that special ed pull-out time? And if I was, some of the things would be, then you have to provide it one-on-one. You're going to have to provide more, not less. And if that means that, we get one-on-one instruction, and we get one-on-one instruction for that. But there is a solution. And Dr. Wilson, please weigh in as well.
Yeah, and I think that, some parents have been saying that they've, have this plan that's going to be implemented where the dates are set in terms of when students will be on campus and when they're going to be off campus. And if a parent is seeing that a child is struggling again to access the curriculum virtually, particularly the interventions, then I think it's up to the parents to advocate for that to take place in person. On their in-person days, they need to have math if that's what they're struggling with virtually. And even if that means one-on-one instruction for math at school because they cannot access it virtually on their distance learning days. So I think it's really, again, having a conversation with the school about their individualized education plan and determining what is the best way to deliver it with this new hybrid model that ensures that my child is able to access the curriculum and respond to the intervention so that they can make progress.
And absolutely. And with SB 998, they're very specific if they're going to work on this cohort stuff or the legislation that provides the opening in cohorts, which again, the districts, the elementary schools, and they can do it different, but if following this, then they can get the one-on-one. It says if you can't break into the group, but Dr. Wilson is right, you really.
Does anybody have any more questions? We're at 5 o'clock. We have a second session at 5:30. So if anybody did not have their questions answered in this session, feel free to come back in the second session and have your questions answered. The Jonathan Foundation is a nonprofit, and we fund assessments, and we were unable to hold our fundraiser this year, had to cancel it twice because of COVID. This session is free. We're not asking or mandating any money, but because it's a nonprofit, if you're happy with what you heard and you can donate any amount of money to the Jonathan Foundation, please go to our website, thejonathanfoundation.org, and the donate button, and donate whatever you feel is appropriate. One last question just popped up. If you don't mind, can I opt not to let my kid go back to school if they open this school year?
I'm not sure what state. Yeah, I mean, but generally, yeah, as a parent, you don't have to ever send your kid to school. But you have to provide an education to them. There's compulsory ed code laws, but in this environment, a lot of schools are going to.
They're in California. Sorry, okay. Richard. Yeah.
No, you don't have to. You can choose a virtual model. They're going to have to provide models, because a lot of this is the students, maybe they, for health reasons or because of the living situation, having compromised people in the home that could be just don't want to send your child back to school. You don't have to. You need to talk with the school and find options of how they can distant learn or virtual learn. Maybe you're okay having some people come to the home. You just don't want them to school. So you can get some people sent from the school to your home to do it. But there is a lot of options, and just ask your school district what they're offering for that.
Okay, great. Session is concluded. We have another session at 5:30. I want to thank everybody for joining and your support, and we look forward to hearing from you at 5:30 if you choose to log back in. Thank you. Hello, my name is Raja Marhaba, and I'm the founder of the Jonathan Foundation for Children with Learning Disabilities and Beyond. I started this foundation in 2001 due to significant challenges that I've had with this broken special education system, trying to get services for my own 2 children. And I wanted to give back to families so that they don't endure what my family went through. This session will be recorded, and we will send a link when it's completed and have you go to our website to listen to the recording. All questions that are going to be answered will be posted also on our website. We'll send you a link so you can go to that for resources and reference. We will have the questions translated into Spanish. We've had a lot of families in the Spanish community asking about transcribing it. So we're going to work on that and improve it in our future webinars. And Omer will be sharing a link, maybe he already has, a document that's going to correspond with the PowerPoint that Richard will be presenting on. And after Richard presents it, we'll open it up for questions. And if you'd be so kind to let us know where you're from, so we see the target population, what areas that the families are in, so we can help you. And with that, I will open the floor with Richard. You can go from there.
I have a slideshow that I'll put together. There's some information, as Raj has said, that you guys can download. It's a quick review of how we got to where we're at. So I'll go through that really quick. The biggest key here for anybody new joining is it's going to be the question and answer. We're really trying to take some of your detailed questions and give you meaningful answers, and take the time to really hopefully address and better point in a direction so you can work with your school district to try to resolve some of the issues that you're facing. So the COVID-19 timeline, there's a little bit more detail in the information. It is really interesting. It's been about 6 months since this has happened. We've learned a lot. There's been a lot of new legislation and some specific, guidance along the way, but actually changes to the law going forward for the 2021 school year. So you can see here, it starts March 4th. That's when the state of emergency was declared, and then we get guidance all along. Just jumping to a few things that are pretty interesting. The March 17th, that told some timelines for assessments. That's why a lot of families struggle to get assessments in the spring. The June 29th Senate Bill 98, that's the legislation that takes us into this school year. Once the schools were ordered to be shut down unless they got off the watch list on July 17th, shortly after that, the elementary school waiver process was given, which means even if you were on the watch list, elementary schools could apply for a waiver. Unfortunately, many didn't. And I don't know the details of that process and what they had to follow. I heard it was really complicated, and that caused, a slowdown of the schools not actually applying for the waivers. And then August 25th, we got some guidance on the schools opening in cohorts. So even if the schools are on the watch list, small groups of students, and they should start with like the English language learners, they should start with special ed kids, those that really aren't accessing the learning in any meaningful way, those are the ones that should come to school first to get related services. Some school districts have started that. Others are waiting and kind of roll out everything at once, which would be for the general ed kids, what it's going to look like for special ed kids, and everything else on how the schools are going to open. There are differences between, high school versus middle school versus elementary schools. On March 24th, though, and I just want to, this is a statement of the guidance, the early guidance that schools had. And this is from the U.S. Department of Education and the California Department of Education. And, the guidance was, it's obviously more detailed than this, but during school site closures, school districts must provide equitable access to students with IEPs, with services appropriately tailored to the individualized needs of students to the greatest extent possible. Just like with the word appropriate in FAPE, what's appropriate for one may not be appropriate. The greatest extent possible for one district might be different, or for one student might be different, but they have to be appropriately tailored to the individual needs of each student. And I think that's where, and Dr. Wilson will talk about this too with some of your questions, how do we understand what that is? How do we understand what getting the services appropriately tailored to your student requires? Those are things that you're gonna have to discuss with the IEP team. So California Senate Bill 98, this is signed into law June 29th, so at the end of June. IEPs must include a description of the means by which the IEP will be provided under emergency conditions. That's new to the code. You're gonna have to have that discussion with the IEP team. I've seen some districts, and it's really strange, I think this is gonna be a problem litigation-wise for them, where they'll offer they'll make one offer of FAPE that's for school, but they'll actually reduce the offer for distant learning. And since the goals haven't changed, the students' needs haven't changed, I think that's going to be problematic. And right now, that's some of the issues that we're dealing with as we push things forward. And then the new requirements apply to an initial IEP or the next regularly scheduled revision of an IEP. So the districts don't have to have an IEP for everybody right now and put in an emergency learning plan. We are considering emergency learning plans to be the distant learning plans. Most districts are, but some are choosing to even fight that and say that the distance learning plan doesn't, is not the emergency learning plan. So everybody's, handling this new legislation a little bit differently. You can go to the next slide, Omar. And before we get right here, the one thing I wanted to read, just a couple of things, and this might help your questions that you guys might add. Part of Senate Bill 98, and this is the information that you can download, is a learning continuity and attendance plan, continuity and attendance plan. some of the pieces that need to be in there are how the district will address student learning loss. So they have to address this now. And Dr. Wilson can talk about that, how the school district will assess students to measure student learning status. That means their loss, where are they at today? How they have to address this. And then what actions and strategies the school district will use to address learning loss and accelerate learning progress. How the effectiveness of the services or supports provided to address learning loss will be measured. And then what actions and strategies the school district will use to address learning loss and accelerate learning progress for students as needed, and how those strategies differ for the students with IEPs. So all students this applies to, but then how does that differ for students with IEPs? This law is really specific, and it's really good because it gives the guidance for the school districts to understand how are we going to address, how are we going to assess, how are we going to measure. So, when you have those questions, we can address them more specifically. The other piece that SB 98 requires is the mitigation of learning loss. Extending the instructional year is an option. Increase the amount of instructional time is an option. Providing additional academic services is an option. Intensive instruction for addressing educational gaps. And then professional development opportunities to help teachers and parents support students in distant learning contexts. And then SB 98 states that the school districts are encouraged to carefully review these new regulations, including the required components of the IEP, and to make sure that students with disabilities are being served for the upcoming school year. So we know that there was a big failure in the spring. The idea now is to figure out how we fix this going forward. And this new legislation's going to help that, but school districts have to implement, they have to be taught about it. And I think parents play an important role, and experts like Dr. Wilson play a really important role to get this information to the team and help them actually use it so it benefits your children. And as the last slide here is, it's just work with your team, not against it. Don't get overly frustrated. If you run into a wall, there are solutions, and we can talk about that in some of your questions.
I'm going to start off with a question, and hopefully the group will follow. I've had parents that have called me and asked me about signing an affidavit and taking their children out of the public school fear of COVID and homeschooling them, but they become the homeschool versus actually going to an existing homeschool that's already credentialed and established. When the parents do this, do they continue to have IEP in place, or what happens with this?
No, I mean, if you're going to privately place in your own home as a home school, the answer would be no. You'd be a parentally placed private school student. And that's a great option for some. You can go on to the CDE website, you can fill out a private school affidavit, you could, and you become your own school for compulsory ed code purposes. And there are programs through the Department of Education, the different counties, or even the school district might have a homeschool program. So if you're looking at a homeschool program through that and not your own, there are different options there. But if you are your independent homeschool, you're going to not have the IEP with the school district anymore.
To piggyback on that, some of the families that I have advocated for try to go to existing homeschools, but they are closed and not accepting any more students because they're overwhelmed. And that's part of the reason why parents are choosing to sign off and have this affidavit. And I know if they have services in place in the IEP and they decide to no longer have an IEP by doing their own personal homeschool, then they give up a lot of rights. And so if they do this and then they decide, oh, I made a mistake, or it's not working for me, I want to go back to the school, do they have to start all over again with an IEP? Do they have to have an initial IEP, or do they continue the IEP they had?
It's really up to the school district, and I've seen it work both ways. We'll have students who will be privately placed, by their parents, so they'll be removed from the public schools, and they'll come back a few years later. And that initial IEP date will remain as that first date, and their parents just left. Other times I've seen district change it, and that initial entrance into special ed is the new date when they enter the district. But if you look at it through, if you're going to change school districts or move from out of state and they become new to the school district, you know, a lot of times they're going to use that original date into special ed, and that doesn't really matter. Anytime you bring the student back for an IEP, the district should assess anyways, be it the initial assessment or just a re-eval. So the name I wouldn't worry too much about. Most likely it's just going to be a reevaluation, especially if you're going back to the same district. They're going to have all the documents, they're going to have the prior IEPs, and that happens a lot of times with the families that we're working at. They're bouncing from private school back to public. But the biggest piece, if you come back, is just request special ed assessments. You talk about your other IEP, and they're going to have to provide a FAPE.
One other question: when school goes back to in-person learning, and this is probably going to affect the general education students as well as special education students, are school districts going to be assessing the general ed students if the parents request it because there's been a loss and a gap in learning?
Yeah, I mean, if you make a request for special education assessment, the threshold for assessing is really low. So if a teacher, you know, recommends it, if a parent recommends it, there's a lot of legal guidance, though it's not in the law that they have to assess. But if you look at their court decisions, when a parent requests, the district, really should assess. And if they're not, they better have a really good reason and data to show that they don't need to assess. But to answer your question, if there's going to be a lot of parents, and Dr. Wilson can add into this because she knows working with these families that there's probably going to be families that didn't know their children were struggling. They're going to be requesting assessments. So what's the district going to do with the flood of assessments? But the law doesn't change for them. We'll just see what they do. And Dr. Wilson, you might want to add to that.
Yeah, and I'm already seeing that come up where there are a number of people who are calling. Some people are calling because they already have an IEP and their kids are struggling more with distance learning, even with the interventions that were in place as a result of the IEP. Then you've got other families who, again, like Richard was saying, are seeing difficulties for the first time, where they said, my child wasn't struggling before, but now with this transition to distance learning, they can't access the curriculum. So it's really impacting their ability to learn. And so this would be a new evaluation. And then for some kids, I'm also seeing parents who were told by the school district that their child did not qualify for services. And now that they have transitioned to distance learning, they're experiencing even more difficulties than they had when they initially requested it. And so for those families, they may want to go back to the school and say that now with this transition to distance learning, my child is struggling, can't access the curriculum, and really request another evaluation, because the mode of instruction has changed so drastically to in-person learning. And for some kids, it impacts them much more than others. And for some kids, it just really prohibits them from learning in that way. And it can be because of a learning challenge, because of the way their brains are wired. And for some kids, it's because of a social and emotional factor, and there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of stress. And what we know from the research is that significant anxiety and stress can impact a child's ability to learn. And it's very difficult for a child to learn when they're scared and anxious and worried. And for a lot of kids, the mental health challenges that COVID has presented needs to be addressed as a new issue or as a comorbid issue.
I have a piggyback question on that. How do we help young children, 4, 5, 6 years old, that are very hyper, they can't sit still, they cannot do the distant learning, that may have behavioral challenges? What do the parents do, or how do we help them?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different, first of all, you have to kind of identify what the reason is for the struggle. And so if that's been identified as an attention issue, an ADHD, an autism spectrum disorder, then there are things that can be done to address those struggles, either from a behavioral perspective, from a psychotherapy perspective, or from medication management if it's appropriate. So those are discussions that the family needs to have with not only the school district, but with a pediatrician, their child's pediatrician. And again, if there is an anxiety component, an ADHD component, then they're really going to have to seek mental health services if that's not already being provided to them. And a lot of parents are now seeking mental health services for their children and for themselves as a result of this challenge. And so there are a number of different things that can be done in terms of behavioral support, having a behavioral aid, help the family develop strategies for focus and for staying engaged. For some, it may be that they will have to not engage in a video conference classroom, and they may have to have one-on-one support for learning, and have that be done at home with the aid of a tutor, an educational therapist, or a parent who's been trained to administer the instruction. So it really depends on the child and the unique challenges faced by the child and the family to determine what's the best course of action. But it really, again, begins with, and I know we talked about this in the last session, but having a conversation with the school, having a conversation with the pediatrician as appropriate, and to make sure that your child is getting the appropriate level of support depending on what the underlying issues are.
Richard, I have a question for you. How difficult is it to get a one-on-one aid support to go to the home and help out? Because that's a big topic. And before you answer that, if I can just ask the participants to ask your questions in the Q&A. There's a question in the chat box, and I'll get to it after this question that Richard answers. Thank you.
It's going to be interesting to see, we have students that have direct services, be it a nurse, be it a one-to-one ABA aide, be it an interpreter, and the districts are struggling to provide that in the home. They're trying to do it virtually, which is just a waste of time. It doesn't work. We're also finding now that some of the agencies still aren't sending people to the home. Just for example, we have a nursing agency that won't send their people to the home, which is really frustrating because we have and then so on one end we have districts willing to, they're just struggling to find agencies, and they can't send their own people sometimes because of their own contract, and then they're sending their employees to the home, but they'll pay for outside agencies. We're going to get there once school is in session. And for in California, that's really going to roll out soon for everybody. They can provide services in the home. If they're going to bring the kids to school for services, they absolutely can provide services in the home. So the struggle right now has been trying to get the home services while schools are just in virtual learning. That problem goes away. And most districts will agree to that yeah, we're going to have to. If we're going to bring them to school, we have to send somebody to the home. So as Dr. Wilson said, I think you really got to look at what specifically your child needs, and then work with the district to provide that, because we have so many different venues now of how the students are going to be learning. We're going to have some in hybrid programs. We're going to have some going to school 5 days a week. We're going to have some still virtually learning, but that doesn't change it for your child. In whatever format they're accessing their education, we got to make sure that the program works. And Dr. Wilson walked through some really good ideas of how we get there. I wish there was like a magic pill and you just go to the district with this, but unfortunately we have to really by proof, and by proof I'm meaning assessments, observing, figuring out where your child's going and what's not working. We can get people, and when I say we, families, we all can get people into the home, but you're going to have to show why it's necessary to access the education. That's where Dr. Wilson comes in.
Okay, I'm going to ask this question from Crystal. We are in Tennessee district, and right now a percentage of the children are virtual, and the other percentage in school, now the ones that's going virtual, are having a difficult problem trying to get their children in school because they cannot handle the virtual learning. Do you think it will be wrong for the school system to not allow those children not to come back to school, or do you think it will be another COVID-19 issue if they allow all the children to come back?
So can you break that apart, Raja? So the way I understood it was it's some in virtual, some going back, and they want.
Yeah, I'll break it up for you. This parents in Tennessee, right now the percentage of the children are virtual, and the other percentage is in school. Now the ones that's going virtual are having a difficult problem trying to get their children in school because they cannot handle the virtual learning. That's the first half of it.
Right. Okay. So, and then they're thinking about bringing those students back.
Yeah. If you're okay with the first half, the second half is, do you think it will be wrong for the school system to not allow those children not to come back to school, or do you think it will be another COVID issue if they allow all the children to come back?
So Yeah, breaking that question apart, because we have general ed kids, we have special ed kids. And you're in Tennessee, I'm not sure on the education laws there. So this is just general knowledge. Obviously, that's not legal advice or anything, but it might give you a start in a direction. I think it's going to be problematic for any district, even though they say this, like you have to choose one and you can't change. I think that's going to be problematic. I think that a parent can change if they want to, if they're at school and they want to go virtual. I really think they should be able to do that. And I think legally they're going to be able to. And I think the saying the other way, if you're virtual and you want to go back to school, if you're not learning virtual and you need to be in school, they're going to have to provide that option. How you get there, and if the district's going to be willing or if they're going to fight, is a different story. But obviously the student needs to be where they can access their learning. And since this is so new, trapping parents into an early decision doesn't make any sense. So I don't think that will hold up. The other piece about the COVID, I'm not sure where it's at with Tennessee and the numbers, if they have any restrictions on who they can bring back. I know in California, what they're doing is to try to solve that is they're just rotating. So when Gen Ed goes back, for a lot of school districts, they're coming back just 2 days a week, and then they're virtual learning the other days. And they're not going to bring all the students back. I have no idea if you bring them back, what's going to happen. I mean, we all hope for the best, but I don't know. I think the schools are going to be flexible, and I think that the parents are going to have to just continue to make changes as needed. Dr. Wilson, what do you think?
So, I mean, I think there's a number of different things that are coming up with this question. And I think one of the questions is it wrong for the school system to not allow kids to come back? Well, and again, I will piggyback on what Richard is saying. If a child is really struggling with virtual learning and there's an opportunity for that child to come back and learn face-to-face, then I think that it's the parent's job to advocate for what it is that your child needs. And I think a lot of parents feel like they have been forced into a decision, whether to do virtual, 100% virtual, a hybrid, or in person when it's available. And so now, with the reality of being able to transition back to school, some parents who may have chosen virtual because they thought the risk was too high to bring them back and now see the struggles, are now going to have to advocate for their child to say, I know that I chose virtual, but my child cannot access the curriculum in this manner. And so then the school has to come up with, what can we do to help this child learn? Because really it is about, is your child able to learn? And that's the whole reason why we do these evaluations, is to understand why a child is struggling with learning. And for some kids, the struggle will be because of the way the curriculum is being delivered, right? And that may coincide with a learning disability, and maybe a learning disability has not been diagnosed previously, and it may be something we want to look at now, because again, the structure of school can be a compensatory mechanism for a lot of kids who have underlying issues. And then when you take that structure away, and they can no longer compensate for an area of difficulty, and then the difficulties begin to emerge. And that's when it's the parents it's on the parents to really tell the school what it is that they're observing, so that their child can get the support that they need, even if that means in-person instruction for their child.
And just adding to that, yeah, absolutely agree. I think if you have an IEP, it's going to be easier because they have to really individualize it. I think if they have a set policy for Gen Ed kids or something that they're not going to change, I think it goes back to what Dr. Wilson says. You really need to document it, because if they don't want parents flip-flopping. And obviously, just looking at it from a school district's perspective, they set these policies, but policies are policies, or they're not laws. So they have a policy that parents can't shift. Of course, there's going to be exceptions to that, but the best way to get to a yes is to document and show why it's not working. So if it's not working virtually, show that, because the educators care. They want to make it work.
The way that you could show it's not working virtually is by videotaping your child doing distant learning, and also keeping a log, like a diary with the date, the time, the teacher, the challenges that your child had during that period of learning, and bring it into the IEP when you have either a virtual IEP or an in-person IEP when the time allows. And that would be your way of showing them this is what's happening at home, because you guys are the educators at home with your children, and the teachers are trying to do their best virtually, but it's a very difficult challenge for both. So the only way that the school and the IEP team is going to understand what's happening with your child at home is by documenting, and documenting is really important, because if you don't document, then it never happened. So if it happened, then you can at least show that it happened, and it would be easier for you during the IEP process.
Yeah. Another thing that I would say, Raja, is that I would encourage parents to not delay in contacting the school when you see your child starting to struggle, because the longer you wait, the larger the gap and the greater the losses. And so as soon as you start seeing the struggles, yes, document it, but reach out to the teachers to see what can be put in place to really address the difficulties that you're seeing, particularly if it's behavioral. You know, a lot of parents are saying, I cannot get my kid to sit in front of the screen to participate in a Zoom lesson, or like, you know, they're turning off the video camera, they're refusing to sit in front of the camera. So those are behavioral issues that may be tied to an underlying learning issue. It may be tied to anxiety, like I've said before. It may be something new that's emerging. It may be a combination of things that are manifesting as a result of the pandemic that we're in. But there really needs to be communication with the school in terms of what you're observing, so that you can get the support that you need earlier, and not wait until things become, you know, out of control.
And just adding to that too, I mean, and I know this seems to be the common theme, but communication really is key. And obviously you start with the teacher. Sometimes you can just fix it there at that level, and you can just come up with strategies, or they can put students in breakout rooms, or the student can, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. I know in California now they have to do daily attendance. So you actually have to be on so much time. And for some of us, the families, were just telling them, so what? Like, it's not working. And it actually, I feel, works in the family's favor, because of the district's documenting it now. They're documenting that the student's not logging on because the student can't. And I think, but there are easy ways. And so I agree, Dr. Wilson. I think just giving that early communication is can really help a lot. One, it builds that trust and that communication with the education team. And hopefully a quick fix can happen and address the area of need.
Right. And I think there can be strategies when you communicate directly with the teacher that might be helpful. For some teachers, you might say, you know, he just cannot have the screen with the gallery view open. Or a lot of teachers will say, oh, I need to see everybody's face. You need to have your video on. But if you communicate to the teacher that it is a distraction for my child to have the video on, then that can be a really quick accommodation for your child, that they can hear your child's voice, but they have their video turned off. And so there are little things that you can put in place to address some of the issues you might be having. It might be that your child logs on, you know, 10 minutes before everyone else logs on, and has that one-on-one time with the teacher to get comfortable. And then they can get attendance, and then they can turn their video off and then just listen to the lesson. So again, you need to communicate with the teacher, so some of these things can be put in place. You may mean that your child needs an earlier break. You know, some parents have said that my child is in first grade and they are on Zoom for an hour straight before they get their first break. That may be too long for your child to wait for a break. And so again, communicating to the teacher that your child needs a break prior to that hour. You know, after 15 minutes, my child is going to need a break. He's going to step away from the screen. We're going to go get a glass of water. Then we're going to come back and we're going to rejoin the class, but we can't wait an hour for that first break, because of attention issues, because of behavioral issues, because of other underlying difficulties that the child might be having. And so again, it's about communicating that information to your teacher, to your child's teacher, so that you can have a plan put in place to address any difficulties your child is experiencing.
I have a question. What happens when school opens and there's been a loss of education for both general and special education students, and now the general ed students are behind and they need to be assessed, and then you have the special ed students that have their annual, triannual, and they need to be assessed, or they have a loss of learning too? Will the system be overwhelmed, and will the school be able to handle the flow of families coming through asking for assessments?
You can start Wilson, what are your thoughts?
I'm from what I'm hearing, there are a lot of parents that are concerned, and I believe that there is going to be a backlog, because I know a lot of assessments didn't take place in the spring, and that and like Richard was saying, they need to take place. For some parents, again, they are seeing for firsthand their children struggling, and in a way that they would not have observed in the classroom because they weren't there. And so I think those parents are going to be requesting evaluations because of the struggles and because of the learning losses they are observing as a result of this transition. So I believe that there is going to be a backlog, and it's really about educating parents about the process, because so many parents who have not been through the IEP process do not know what their rights are and where to begin.
I absolutely agree. And I think, even before all this, districts would easily say no to parent requests for assessment. And, they would, let's start with something, like let's work through the student study team. Let's try a 504 plan. And they'll encourage parents to pull the request for the special ed assessment. I think that for a lot of parents, they're going to hear no. And that doesn't mean the district's right. They can just say no. And what are you going to do next? And that's really unfortunate. I think for the gen ed students who just need, like SB 98 requires, they're going to have to do assessments. The teachers can do assessments. They can come up with where are they at with present levels and learning losses. Aren't special ed. On the special ed side, districts are going to have to either do poor assessments, because if they take the time to do really good assessments, they're going to be understaffed for it. And, we don't want to waste time with poor assessments. We want just one set of assessments. That's what families are requesting it. I think that they should look at contracting a lot of these assessments out. I've seen some districts asking parents to waive the assessment, and this is for the triennial assessments, just saying we have too many assessments, we're doing the initials, we'd like you to waive, and we'll push off the triennial. And for some families, they'd be fine with that. And I think that could possibly be a good solution. But what I'd hate to see is the districts forcing family to. So, and just a second piece of that, what would the law require? I think sometimes we look at procedural violations. When I say procedural violations, so they violate your right to get an assessment, or they violate the triennial assessment timeline, where they have to assess and complete the assessment within every 3 years. Well, what's the consequence of that? And I think the districts are going to weigh that cost benefit analysis, and they're going to say, so we delay assessment 3 or 4 months. What damage is that? What provable damage? And is a family going to go to court and try to get some kind of damage fee for that? So I think that there might be a lot of non-compliance, and it's just because their hands are strapped. But I don't think there needs to be. I think that they can assess. I think that they should assess, and I think that they should contract out to get the assessments done. Because if you really want to focus on the students and catch up over this last 6 months, we have the students who need the initial assessments. We have those that are coming up for the try assessments, and they're all equally as valuable. And I think that we really just need to make sure. I'm afraid, though, that some districts are just going to throw up their hands and say, so we missed the deadline. And that's going to be unfortunate.
And I think the other issue, when you talk about poor assessments, that's when you get a lot of parents requesting those IEs, because they're not happy with the evaluations that were done, and they want to make sure that their child gets a good evaluation. But then those are evaluations that the school district has to pay for. So then it becomes this financial issue for the school district in terms of paying for those evaluations. But if you're going to assess loss of learning, or you're going to determine what kinds of interventions need to be put in place to accelerate learning as a result of losses, then you have to do an evaluation to determine what is needed.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting how every district's handling this different. Just for example, we have districts that are just taking the offer of FAPE, and they're saying, okay, we'll put that exact offer into the distance learning plan to the best extent possible. Meaning that we're not changing service hours, we're not changing. And now have other districts that are saying, oh, that's just for in-school placement, but we're going to change it. We're going to lower the services, which doesn't make any sense. And I think there's going to be some districts that are going to try to follow, get all the assessments done, and just going to work extra hard. And they want good assessments because they don't want the cost of paying for all the IEEs. And I think there's going to be other districts, unfortunately, that are just going to say, oh, well, we just can't do it. And I think, but for the families that want a solution, I think if you're diligent in requesting it, documenting the request and showing why Why do you think your child should get assessed now? What's changed? I think you're going to have more success. And I think you'll find more yes people with that. I think it might be the families that are just requesting assessment, but they don't know why. They just know it didn't work at home. I want a special ed assessment. But there's no documentation. I think the districts could more easily deny that request.
Okay, we have a question from a parent. Do you think districts will be holding students back as a way to deal with the delay in learning? And if so, what could be done in order to be more progressive and help catch up a child?
I'm not sure what districts will be doing in terms of holding kids back, but I think, again, it really has to be individualized in terms of what those losses look like. Because for some kids, they will do fine in math. There will be no learning losses there, but there might be a loss in language arts or comprehension, or reading comprehension. And so the intervention and a way to kind of mitigate that loss is going to be different depending on where the losses are. And we know from the research that depending on where those losses are, there are absolutely good interventions that target specific areas of weakness. We know this from the learning disability literature. You know, if a child is regressing in terms of is just learning to read and has regressed in their understanding of phonological processing, there are evidence-based interventions that we know that work with kids with dyslexia, where you can make up for those losses. You can rewire the brain with these targeted interventions, particularly when they're delivered in an intense way. So it really depends on what the loss is. But the research again shows us that there are absolutely things that can be done, and they can be done in an intense way, and they can really address the underlying issues without holding kids back.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add to that yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think sometimes families don't understand how, I don't say little, but the school year is a big year. How much learning actually happens, like real learning, you could break it down. So, I mean, we have students who just don't go to school for certain reasons, and they can get caught up. Once you identify what they're missing, like Dr. Wilson was saying, you can implement really good programs and strategies to quickly bring them up to speed. So knowledge on that is really important. If you're young, and you know, for families that are thinking, gosh, you know, my child was in kindergarten, maybe I'll just have them repeat, or first grade. I think it's a different analysis than if you're, you know, older. Retention is really not a good thing. There's a lot of research on retention and the outcome, the long-term negative effect from graduation rates are a lot lower to self-esteem, and just overall happiness in life is a lot lower. So we've gotten away from the retention model, but I think it would be valid for, and Dr. Wilson, I don't know what you think on this, but what about like the really young kids where the parents feel like they got pulled in March? Maybe it's just easier to repeat the grade.
Yeah, I think it really depends again on the child. You know, if they were a young kindergartner and it, you know, they might benefit from repeating that year in person. But again, it really depends on the child. Some kids will do fine with a great summer program and be able to pick up in first grade and be just fine. And so again, we talked about kind of extending the school year, implementing an intense summer program. There's a number of things that can be done, but it really depends on the child. I would never say that, you know, all kids who struggle in kindergarten should repeat kindergarten, because it's not going to be appropriate for every child.
You know, just adding to that too, I mean, don't you think, I mean, since say you're in a kindergarten class, that whole class is going to go to first grade. So I think that, you know, especially with SB 98 talking about specific interventions and assessments, I think the whole class will be getting they're going to be covering stuff that wasn't covered, or going back and repeating stuff. That's just my thought. I don't, what do you think?
Yeah, that is my thought as well, is that they're going to take all of these things into consideration when they're developing the curriculum for next year.
I have a comment, a personal comment. My son, Jonathan, was retained in the first grade, and he has extremely high comprehension. He's considered twice exceptional, highly gifted, and learning disabled. When you have a child that has a high comprehension level and you retain that child, you absolutely hurt their self-esteem, because they know that they don't belong there. They don't understand why they are where they are. And personal experience, my son Jonathan, and he's 29 now, he has never ever forgiven me for retaining him in the first grade. He had, I kid you not, he's one of the panel, he's a participant in this, and he knows what I'm talking about. And he's always told me, you should have never retained me. And he struggled. We ended up moving to another residential home, another school district. And we thought that, with new friends, it would be easier. But, he knew why. He understood why. He had a high comprehension. But he didn't understand the entire scenario because he was only 7 years old. And so even when we went through high school, and in high school, he dual enrolled in Mill Park College because he wanted to make up the year he lost because his mom, who he blames me, retained him. And I went through a lot of guilt because I thought, oh my gosh, they retained him. It was an easy way out when they could have given him intensive educational therapy because he's severely dyslexic, and they could have helped him and done the summer schooling and give him one-on-one and do like a Lyndon Bell or an Orson Gillingham kind of program. And it took, honestly, an act of God to get my children where they needed to go. And I'm talking 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, I struggled with everything the families are struggling with right now, and the system hasn't changed. So I'm very conflicted with retaining a child for my own personal reasons. But Dr. Karen Wilson, you do have a point. Some children may be okay with it, but maybe the children that have high comprehension may not be okay with it, because my son was not okay with it, and it caused a lot of conflict with me and Jonathan. A lot of behavioral problems growing up.
One of the things that Richard said, and that is absolutely true, is that the research really does not support retaining kids who have learning struggles by retaining them a grade. And some parents actually would do this and delay the onset of kindergarten for similar reasons, and they call that redshirting. And the research is very clear on that as well, that that's also not particularly beneficial to kids, and it has poor outcomes later on.
I can ask another question. Just open it up. What happens to related services, occupational therapy, speech and language? How does the school district incorporate that in distant learning? Do they have programs? Are they able to do that? How effective is that?
Yeah, so everything in the IEP has to be implemented, and to the best extent possible. So once schools go back, they're going to have to provide all the related services. Even in the distance learning, they're going to have to provide the in-person services if they can. So we have some families that are going to be taking their students to school, but they've chosen the virtual model or remain on distant learning. We have other families that don't want to go to school at all, and the district's going to have to provide those services, and we're working that out. But the obligation doesn't go away. And it's just having that conversation with the school and how they're going to allow it to happen. They're going to allow it to happen. For those districts that can't send it home, they're going to have to hire non-public agencies to go to the home if the families want the service there. The service needs to happen.
So then do these families, if these related services are not happening now virtually, these children are put on hold and they're going to regress, whether it's, physical therapy, whether it's occupational therapy, speech and language therapy. So do we allow them to regress because of COVID? And this is it, and this is the alternative that the parents have until they open it up, and then you can go back to somewhat normal, whatever that is?
No, I don't think we let them regress. And once schools are, and I'm talking about California, since a lot of those schools are going to be opening up, they're going to have to provide all the related services. Right now, they're trying to provide them, via Zoom, virtual. We have OT being provided. Some of the stuff's been working pretty well for some of our students virtually. It's one-on-one. They come in, they do it. Parents are happy, and we're seeing we're seeing progress. There's no issue there. For other students, they full on cannot access it. So there is that regression. That's part of the discussion that the school is going to have. They're going to have that comp ed piece. Like, okay, so, and we know with the comp ed analysis, it's not hour for hour lost. This is where, Dr. Wilson, as you keep hitting on too, the assessments come in all these areas. We have to know, had the student been getting the services, where would they be now? And then what additional services do they need to get to where they should be? And it's not an hour for hour. So it's something that the IEP teams are going to have to discuss. So using OT as an example, if they didn't get any meaningful OT for 5 months, well, what additional OT hours do they need to close that gap? And that's something that the team's going to discuss, and they're going to have to provide going forward. What do you think, Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, I completely agree. And it might be, again, if we're talking about making up for losses and loss of skill or even regression of skills, it will often mean that you have to increase the intensity of the intervention, even if it's for a short period of time. So for a child who is getting OT once a week, it might be twice a week that they need to get it in person when they resume classes. But again, it's going to be based on what you've observed, what you've documented. If there's been a complete inability to access that intervention, then again, that has to be communicated to the team to determine what needs to be done to accelerate progress.
And we've seen this in districts. Some of the rural districts, they just can't find an OT. So all the students with OT, they don't get OT for a year. They just don't have anybody, and they know that they're going to have to deal with it. And what they do is, once they do, they assess the students. And now that situation I'm thinking of, I think they went hour for hour. So the district said, "Hey, we'll just make it all up." And there's no perfect situation, but if we're looking at going forward, and that's a great thing, increasing the intensity of it, it can be short-lived. But those are really good discussions for the team to have, not only continuing services going forward, but catching up for the missed time.
Right. And at the same time, you don't want it to be overwhelming for the child, because again, if a child has not been able to access speech and language and OT, you don't want to increase the intensity so much that it's overwhelming when school resumes, where they can't even, participate in a general education environment because you're giving them all this intervention. So again, it has to be balanced, and it has to take into consideration what the child can handle as well.
And speaking of that, I think we're looking at two things. We're looking at getting the program good going forward first. I think that's the number one priority. Let's get a good IEP, the good services in place that's in person going forward. And then second, we have to look at, well, what do we do about the lost time? And like you said, sometimes some parents, I think, are going to just let that go because they can't fit any more time in their day. They can't add more hours to the day. So they have a good program going forward, and it's working now. And in that sense, that's a win too.
I have a question from Jonathan. If a child has special needs and you're allowing them to regress when they are having trouble keeping up with the standard learning curriculum, how is it fair to the child to then have to put forth additional effects or efforts to make up the regression? How will this affect them psychologically, and how long can we hope that they sustain their drive before getting burned out? And this is coming from somebody who actually went through this. So Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to kind of what I just said earlier, is that you don't want to overwhelm kids, because it's not only about getting them the intervention to support learning. It's really about having them really maintain the love of learning and the motivation for learning. Because the last thing you want to do is say, now we've got to make up for all of the losses. So we're going to double your math, double your reading, double your speech and language, double your OT. And that's just too overwhelming for a child. So we're going to have to come up with a solution that spreads out the level of the intervention that a child needs over an extended period of time. That might mean doing some of that work over the summer. But again, it has to be individualized. You have to be able to pay attention to the psychological needs of the child. And again, I say it over and over again, you have to really look at the mental health needs of the child, not only the academic needs, because they both go hand in hand. And if you don't attend to the psychological needs, the child is going to have difficulty accessing the curriculum, even if you have a great academic intervention plan.
Just adding to that, because absolutely agree. One of the things we work with families a lot with too is we're trying to identify, and I think the social, emotional, the anxiety, the stress, they're so focused on the loss of learning, but you can't address that until you address the other things that are causing that. And I know we don't want to throw more stress on the students. It's unfortunate that this happened. It's unfortunate that a student is struggling, now is expected to work even harder. And I agree with you, Dr. Wilson. I think if we pull back, they're going to learn. When we have students who, like I said before, who have missed school for a year, 2 years, they haven't been in school, and we get them back, they get caught up. Once we figure out what's inhibiting the learning, the learning it's like a rocket. I mean, they'll just take off. We have students who haven't been able to read for years, and once we get the right intervention, it takes off. So I think we really don't over stress. It's okay if they're a little bit behind now. It happened, the school's shut down, but let's not stress them out.
I don't have any more questions from the participants, but I have one final question for you, Richard. Regarding Comp Ed, I know from personal advocacy experience, that's not simple for the school district to give the families, and they make it very difficult for families to obtain Comp Ed when you're in IEP meetings. How difficult or easy will that be now with COVID taken into consideration, the loss of learning? Would school districts be more collaborative to provide Comp Ed without going to a due process to get Comp Ed?
Yeah, and Dr. Wilson, you can add to this too, because so much of it's the assessments and what we're looking at. Because we already know from the guidance that they have to have this discussion, they're going to be much more willing. Now, if you're talking about the quantity or the quality of the Comp Ed, that might be where the dispute comes in, which requires due process. I think, as always, it's easier if parents can pay for intervention first and seek reimbursement. For those that can do that, I think they're going to have a bit of an advantage. For others, when you're going to the district, I think the districts, and I'm curious to get your opinion on this too, Dr. Wilson, may use summer, and that summer break is a reason, like, oh, well, it was summer regression. How do you know it was COVID regression? And I think that the fight is going to be on the quality and the quantity.
Yeah, and I've said this before. I think it's going to be very hard to determine what is responsible for the losses, and I think at the end we just don't know. It's probably going to be a combination of a number of different things. It's going to be an inadequate spring instruction from the last academic year. It's going to be the inability to provide any kind of support over the summer. And then it's going to be the onset of distance learning for the fall, with the backdrop of a pre-existing learning disability or other health impairment that impacts a child's ability to learn. So there are going to be a number of different factors playing a role, but regardless of what the reason is, if a child is struggling, they're going to need support.
Absolutely. And so to answer the question specifically, Raja, I think that it's going to be much easier. And I think that they're going to be providing stuff, even, in school stuff, like I read before, some of the guidance and stuff and the law changes, they can provide additional hours of support. They can provide tutoring. They're going to be creative, I think. I think that as a parent, what I would look at, and as a lawyer too, what we look at is they're going to be giving some assessments to these students to kind of see where they're at. What we've seen so far a little bit is they'll give a pre-assessment. The student will do totally terrible on it. They'll review it. They'll, for lack of a better word, coach them on it, and they retake the assessment. The students do much better. And like, see, they're good. We always like to look at that first shot, that first assessment that they get. How did they do? I think you, as a family, you want to request that documentation. You want to know, are they getting assessed a few times in this area, or taught the material again and then retaught it, and then they're being like, how are they actually assessing this? And I assume, Dr. Wilson, that would be helpful for you too when you look at that data of where a student's at.
Yeah, I think I definitely would want to see where they were initially. And I think it's also a good opportunity. I mean, Raja, you talked about some really important interventions that have really moved the needle for a number of kids. When you talk about Orton Gillingham and Linda Mood Bell programs, where the research has shown that they've been really extremely beneficial in helping kids learn to read and to read with comprehension. Particularly when it's delivered in an intense way. And I think it's a good opportunity for parents to advocate for these evidence-based programs for their kids who've really regressed and who've had a pre-existing language-based learning disorder, or who have just been newly diagnosed with the language-based learning disorder, but they didn't have the benefit of a proper academic instruction during the academic year. And it's a good opportunity to advocate for these programs that we know can really result in significant improvements in reading and language-based issues.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the biggest fight is going to be, when you're looking for a specific program that's going to cost money versus some general. I think there's always a big, I know we have to go here, but there's always a big difference between just tutoring and actual academic remediation. And it's funny how many times teachers say, well, what do you mean? What's the difference? I'm like, well, tutoring is just helping the student access the curriculum. The remediation is actually going back and closing that gap. And there's some really good programs that can do that.
Well, and they are expensive, and it took me to go to due process to get Lyndon Mood Bell compensated for my children. And Jonathan was about $20,000, and Omar Jr. was about $16,000. It's not cheap at all. So there's challenges there, but as long as the programs are administered according to the publisher, then it should work for the child. But if they piecemeal the program and they give bits and pieces of the program to the child, you're not going to get the same outcome with the child, because that's my firsthand experience with what happened with my own children.
Well, and that's the fight going to be. It's going to be that meaningful remediation. I'd rather get way less time of a really good program versus the district offering a mediocre program, like you said, that's just piecemeal together, not going to be effective.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, cool. Well, our time is up. Are there any more questions? I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. I'm going to wind it up and thank everybody for participating. Thank you, Dr. Wilson and Richard, for being part of this and being part of the Johnson Foundation family. We appreciate your time and your dedication to the cause. I just wanted to make a brief announcement. The Jonathan Foundation's yearly gala fundraiser was canceled twice this year because of COVID, and we rescheduled it for next year, June 19, 2021. And we're not asking for any money to be part of the discussion panels and give you the free information. We're happy to do that. But if you're able to donate anything and pay it forward for another family, we raise money for assessments, and assessments is going to be a big ticket, as you heard with the entire discussion during the session. So I want to thank everybody for their time and being part of this. And if you have any questions, you can email the Jonathan Foundation at the website. There's an email address, and you can also address us on Facebook. Also, we have a Facebook page, and I monitor both. So thank you so much for your time and for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.